Welcome to the OPSQC Podcast, helping entrepreneurs, innovators, and small business owners scale to profitability. The goal of this podcast is to showcase real businesses, real owners, tell their stories, learn a little, and have some fun while doing it. Today, please welcome Roy Kessel of the Sports Philanthropy Network located here in Greater Chicago. Roy believes in sports for social good and social change. His background is he's a graduate of the Wisconsin School of Business with a BA in Finance and Marketing. He then received his law degree from Northwestern University and has a long list of startup organizations to his credit. He's also been an NFL agent. He's been the chair for the Sports Law Committee and was also involved early on in educating people on baseline concussion testing programs. He has spent the last 2 years organizing the Sports Philanthropy Network to spotlight work done by foundations, athletes, leagues, and teams. I will include links to his current work in the transcripts. Roy, it's always good to see you, and I thank you for taking the time out to be on the podcast out of your busy schedule here. To start, could you give the listeners a little bit of background on what the Sports Philanthropy Network is?
Sure. Again, thanks you for having us here. The Sports Philanthropy Network is a nonprofit, and our mission is to build stronger, healthier, and more inclusive communities through sports. So we do that by working with three primary constituencies. First one would be sports organizations, which would be teams, leagues, governing bodies, associations. The second constituency would be athletes and athlete foundations. And the third would be community-based sports nonprofits. And those would be organizations that use any sport you can conceive of to help develop kids in every aspect. So it's not about building necessarily elite athletes. It's about building better people through sports. And we've seen organizations using any sport you can think of, from ultimate frisbee to surfing to MMA to beach volleyball and beyond. Awesome.
And how long has the SPN been around?
So Sports Philanthropy Network was launched just over 2 years ago. We went through a transition into nonprofit status last year. And so obviously it wasn't a great year with COVID to be a new nonprofit, but we had a great year of growth because we were able to connect with people. I think one of the exciting things that happened in 2020 is, despite all of the hardships, people were looking for opportunities to connect, and they were looking for a way to reach out and see what they could do to help and find resources and find collaboration partners. And so we ran a lot of programming last year: webinars, trainings, workshops, town halls, and then our signature event called Sports Philanthropy World.
Awesome. And for the company right now, or for the nonprofit right now, is it just yourself? Did you have some other people help you initiate and start this?
So from the beginning, it's been me and then our VP of Community Development, Caleb Bradham. And then last year, we started adding more staff in terms of people to do some development, fundraising, sponsorship type of functions. And we brought in a great group of interns last summer. We had more last fall, and we've got a big group this spring. And they've really been integral part of building up the network, allowing us to get a lot more done more efficiently, and freeing up my time because they've taken over a lot of the operational responsibilities for everything to do with podcast production and social media and newsletters and things like that.
Awesome. And for the entity of the company, you guys are a 501c3?
So we're a nonprofit. We operate under what's called a fiscal sponsorship with a group called Players Philanthropy Fund out of Baltimore. So if you look at it in that context, they're essentially like the parent 501c3, okay. And we operate under their 501c3 status, and they have the functions and accounting and bookkeeping, state tax filings, state registrations, everything that we need to do to stay in compliance gets handled by Players Philanthropy Fund. They do a great job. I'll give them a little shout out and plug. If anybody is looking to start a nonprofit, it's oftentimes a more efficient way to do it than to go and start your own organization from scratch.
Definitely. Appreciate the background. That gives the listeners a real good feel about what you guys are. So kind of to break the ice and move forward here, though, is your background involved being an NFL agent. So how did that prompt you to start this philanthropy network? And who were some of your clients when you were an NFL agent?
Yeah, so my whole life I've been around the sports world, been interested in sports, always wanted to work in sports.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as my mom said, somehow I got detoured and went to law school, and she wasn't sure what happened there. But I guess I made sure that didn't last too long. I practiced in firms for about 7 years and really had in my view that I wanted to go and be in the sports world and be an agent. And so back in 1997, when I was leaving, most of the law firms weren't interested in having a sports law practice. And so that's changed a lot in the last 24 years. There's quite a few that have sports law practices, but now the focus is really, at that point, it wasn't. And so the options for me were really leaving the firm and going off on my own. So that's what I decided to do. I started representing a lot of startup sports businesses and entrepreneurs. I put together a lot of celebrity and charity types of golf events, including events for the Tournament of Roses in Pasadena and the NFL Coaches Association, and some casinos and other nonprofits involving NBA players and all-star games. And that was really the genesis of sports philanthropy. But I know you asked about the NFL agent thing. I didn't love the business because what the business has evolved into is not the elements that I wanted to be part of.
Sure.
And so my view is the role of an agent should be to advise and help and cultivate the skills of the athletes so that they're prepared for life after football, in that case, which is what I was doing, but the same concept for any sport. But the players really weren't that open and receptive to that at the time that they're playing. They're more interested in who's going to pay for my training for the NFL Combine, who's going to give me a place to live, in a car, and protein powder and massages and everything that I need to be prepared for my pro day workout for the NFL Combine until I sign a contract. So the challenge is, even if you do a great job in that environment, you're somewhat beholden to how your athletes perform.
Sure.
And so, I didn't have any big name players. I ended up with a few guys that, made it on teams or were going to be on practice squads. And I think one of the frustrations, and I'll give a couple examples just because they're interesting stories, right, is somebody getting hurt, somebody not taking advice as to which team to go to. And so they end up signing in a place where they had a college coach, that a coach that had been their position coach in college that had now moved up to the NFL. Except the problem is that coach doesn't have any clout within the organization. They're also brand new.
Okay.
And so in this particular case, the player elected to go to an organization that at that point was towards the bottom tier of the NFL in terms of how they were perceived, as opposed to, in this case, the example would have been going to the Pittsburgh Steelers, who were coming off a Super Bowl, have a long track record of signing undrafted free agents that do well and make the team. And so in that particular case, when you do that, you end up in a situation where if you get released, right, your choice is, now I'm released from the bottom of the NFL, or if I'd signed with the Steelers and been released, I'm released from the top of the NFL. So if you're released from the Steelers, a lot of teams would say, hey, if the Steelers brought you in, they must have seen something, so I'm going to give you a chance. If you're released from this other team, and I'm not going to call them out because it's
Right.
not any relevant particularly, but if you're released from this other team, well, if you couldn't even make that team, then, why should we bring you in? So that gets frustrating. We had another player who was doing great and through no fault of his own, got released by the team because they had injuries. He was a fullback, but they had injuries in training camp at the defensive back position. and they had multiple injuries. And so they needed to bring in more bodies. Therefore, they had to let that body go. Right. So you get them in another camp, and then the same thing happens. And then you end up spending a lot of time for a year or more working with a player, and they may or may not make it. One other story that I think was interesting from that era, had a player who was a linebacker, and he was great against the run, not necessarily as good in space on the outside. And he was training, doing really well, running great numbers. He was, from the state of Florida. And I talked to his trainer a few times a week to keep track on how he was doing. And I called his trainer up on like the Friday before his pro day, which was on the following Tuesday up in a Big 12 school. And he's like, well, I haven't seen him all week. I said, what do you mean you haven't seen him all week? He's like, well, he's on vacation with his brother in Orlando. And now his brother played in the NFL. I said, he's on vacation the week before his pro day. This is like his big tryout. Right. Oh, yeah, but he told me he was going to be working out, with Dion or with whoever else was supposed to be part of this workout group. So he got off his workout regimen. He came back to the Big 12 school for his pro day and ran okay, but not as well as he had been running. And given his size and numbers, right, he's one of these guys that the differential in talent is pretty small. So when you get outside, even inside, but when you get outside of the top 100 players, which is about the first 3 rounds, right, the difference between a 4th through 7th pick and then the next 500 guys after that is really, really small.
Right.
And so, sure, there are some differences, but you've got to put yourself in the best position to succeed.
Right.
So obviously he didn't do that. When the draft comes, we had teams calling and wanting to sign him as an undrafted free agent. They weren't going to spend a draft pick just because there's too many linebackers, and he wasn't big enough to warrant that.
Sure.
Big enough size wise, right? And his speed had not jumped out at anybody. If you drop another half second would be great. Another 0.05 off of his times and get him into the 4.5, high 4.5 range instead of the mid 4.6 range, it would have been more palatable. So he ends up signing with the New England Patriots.
Okay.
And he shows up at camp. And again, this is the mentality. These are players who have been successful everywhere they've been. And he calls me up and says, wait, they brought in other linebackers to compete with me. Sure. And I said, you're an undrafted free agent. Of course, they're going to bring in other linebackers to compete with you. But he felt that because we picked that as a good fit, the Patriots were coming off Super Bowl. They had a 3-4 defense, so it was a great fit for him because he's not big enough to play the middle in a 4-3, like he's not a Brian Urlacher size kind of guy. Mm-hmm. He was a good fit for the 3-4. And then, we ended up getting a call not that long, a month later that they had released him. And I talked to his position coach, and his position coach, in quoting Belichick, basically I said, help me out. I'm trying to teach the kid what happened, explain to him what he needs to improve on.
Right.
And his response to me was, coach said he's not going to make the team. And so for somebody to get that response in mini camp typically is a function of attitude and work ethic.
Definitely.
I'm not there, so I don't see what happened. But you try and read between the lines and you try and have that conversation. Sure. But when you put the 3 things together, the economic viability of the business, which is really not there until you're at a really significant scale, to the frustration and lack of control of you can work with a player for a year, 2 years, trying to get them an opportunity. And if they don't follow guidance, if they get injured, if they cop a bad attitude, right, you're not getting compensated, right? And three, even on the back end, they're not interested in hearing about post-career planning. Like they've got to focus on how do I succeed today?
No, that makes sense. And I know you've got a ton of stories like that. And that's part of the reason I asked the questions. I know you got some good stories behind you in that part of your career. One of the things to talk about, though, a little bit more in detail is when you started looking at doing the Sports Philanthropy Network. You and I talked last time that you saw there was this void, right? And that a lot of these kids were coming through and, they were kind of being just handed off stuff to do and not really being an active participant as much as you would have thought. Can you kind of go into some background on that and what you meant by that?
Sure. I think one of the challenges when I was running the golf outings, the celebrity types of golf outings, is I would meet these guys. And for me, that was probably the first chance that I had to really sit down with sort of star level players and have conversations with them, and hear what they wanted to do. And one of the ongoing things you heard of was, it's great to play in the outing, but I want to get more involved. I want to do something more for my community. And unfortunately, they're conditioned, typically, the athletes, to believe that their celebrity status is their highest and best use. So they're good for about four things when they're not competing. And that's playing in golf outings, signing autographs, taking photos with people, or showing up at fundraising dinners. Well, that's a gross injustice to these athletes who've been incredibly successful. Doesn't matter what sport you play, men, women, soccer, basketball, hockey, volleyball, right? Any sport.
Yeah.
But what happens is they are conditioned to believe that celebrity status is where they belong. And therefore, they don't get as involved with the organization and learn what the organization does. And the bad part of that is that it hurts both sides of the equation. It really hurts, I'm going to call it three sides of the equation. It's worse for the athlete because they're not learning, they're not getting engaged. It's worse for the organization for the exact same reason, right? They're not learning, they're not getting engaged. And it's worse for the youth that are in the programs because they would respond differently to the athlete coming to their football camp, to their school program. If the athlete had an ongoing connection to the organization, the kids would feel more accountability to the athlete. Yeah. And the athlete would feel more accountability to the kids. So I believe some of these negative behaviors that we see, right, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's drunk driving, whether it's drugs, all kinds of things, the athletes would feel more of a responsibility to the kids in that program if they, in fact, were actively involved. Absolutely. Right? So I think that it's bad in that sense.
No, you're spot on. I think that's, incredible that you have that perception and you have the ability to be in that situation, to witness that, and like I said, observe that void, and then create the Sports Philanthropy Network to kind of step in and help mediate and bring people to the correct point where they need to be in that. When you did this, did you create a formal business plan for the SPN? I know you've done a lot of other types of founder and startup type activities. So, I mean, you have a long list of these behind you.
Yeah. So for this one, I didn't create a formal business plan. In part, it was a function of having done a lot of aspects of what we're doing. And in part, looking at the landscape. So, I'm not saying that creating a formal business plan wouldn't have been useful. Sure. Personally, what I found in my environment is get moving and be ready to adapt a little bit on the fly, because you're never going to learn as much by planning as you will by doing. And when I say that, what I mean is if I look at where we are today, and I would have spent 6 more months before we launched creating a business plan, it would have never looked like what we look like today. I respond to what I hear from people in our network. I respond to what organizations tell us they need in order for them to grow and be successful, and how they want to connect with other people in the sports philanthropy community.
Interesting. That's a very common response, actually, to a lot of people who've been in startups or been through this kind of thing a couple of times. Is, the first time they typically do a very rigid business plan in their first business. Second one, maybe half and half, and then by the third, fourth, fifth, they're just, hey, I know what I need to do. I need to get moving. Like you said, it's more about action and creating what you actually envision. So,
and I think the challenge is when you go through a formal business plan model, it's often for the purpose of raising outside capital.
Yeah.
And when you're doing that, people want to see that you've thought it through. So unless you have a long track record of success and somebody can just pull up Jared's resume and go, well, he started and sold these 5 companies, so I don't need to see a business plan. He's proven he can do it.
Yep.
But very few people are in that level of success.
Absolutely.
Right. So if you look at serial, like what I would truly call serial entrepreneurs and founders, not like the common colloquial term now that everybody is a serial entrepreneur, that's basically started 5 things that have never gone anywhere and they've never stayed with for more than a year.
Yep.
Right. When you're looking for capital, those investors want to see that you've thought through all the elements, and they want to, even if they're not going to challenge a specific number or clause or anything you've put in there, they want to be able to ask questions and say, well, Jared, I know this industry well.
Yep.
Tell me what you've done or researched on this, right?
Sure.
Whether it's AI, whether it's esports, whether anything else. So people want to be able to ask that question. I knew that from our side, we were going to need to build some scale in order for this to be successful.
Absolutely. That's a great segue to the next question, which is, I know when you and I talked, that this has been more of a bootstrap type of venture where, you're self-funding this. Can you talk a little bit about that for the listeners, kind of, what your definition of bootstrap is and what that's really entailed relative to this venture?
Sure. I mean, I think the typical definition applies, which is really, you're self-funding the operation. And I knew that we needed to get to a certain scale before we would be able to go out and raise money as a nonprofit.
Sure.
We always had the plan that we were going to be a nonprofit. That's where we belong, because trying to demonstrate for somebody where they're going to get a financial return in our model is not necessarily how we're going to be most successful. We're going to be most successful by partnering with sports organizations and leagues and athletes to provide these services to the community. So what does that mean? It means you keep the expenses low. It means you try and operate with a smaller staff than I would like.
Yep.
Because we've got to get to scale. So I think we're there. I think 2021 is the year where we will be raising the dollars that we need to be to sustain the organization and the operations.
Okay.
And I think that, as we move forward, that's going to continue to grow.
Yeah, you mentioned that coming into this, right? 2020 hit, whole COVID thing kind of shook things up. What was on the itinerary, or what was on the agenda for 2020 that didn't come to fruition, and how did you make that pivot?
So we actually had quite a bit on the agenda. When COVID hit, we saw pretty quickly that there was a big gap in programming, in ways to bring people together, right? I think now everybody's tired of Zoom. The Zoom fatigue is real. I came up with the term of people being zombies instead of zombies, because you sit on a Zoom call all day, right? I start at 7 in the morning and you're going till 7, 8, 9 at night.
I like
The challenge is that you've got to find a place where there's value. So for us, what we did last year in April and May is we pivoted like really quickly, because right at this time a year ago, we were 11 days into COVID. And we announced that we were going to do 3 podcasts a week. Up to that point, we'd been doing 1. We announced that we were going to do 3 webinars a week. At that point, we had done 0. And we were planning to start doing 1 or 2 a month.
Mm-hmm.
And we decided to go straight to 3 a week because there was a great need. Mm-hmm. So for all of April and May, we did that. It created some great traction, connected us to great people that were helping teach and train this community. And it was before everybody else had said, hey, we need to start creating more programming. So that's what we did in April and May. In the beginning of July, we held a town hall on racism and reform, and we had multiple panels really looking at the issues of how to address it, right? In the wake of George Floyd and all of the other incidents that went on last year, there was a great need for conversation, but we also compiled a report on all of the issues that were coming up and how all of the teams released statements. So this is almost coming up on a year, and one of the projects for our interns that we're going to have them undertake now is to kind of go through and evaluate what have these teams done from these statements. Mm-hmm. What have they really done over the course of a year? It's great to put out a nice statement or a nice tweet and here we go, this is what we're doing, we condemn this. Mm-hmm. But you've now had 12 months. Yep. What's changed? And then we moved our conference from being a live conference at the end of June when it was scheduled to the end of October, and we did Sports Philanthropy World as a virtual conference where we had participation from 30 countries, 327 organizations, and over 430 people.
You know, that accountability piece you talked about, I want to just, focus on that for a second. I think that's such an extremely important piece, and that's such a great aspect of what the Sports Philanthropy Network, is looking to bring there. I know with my company, we do a growing through giving model, and, we've struggled with that as like, how do we show in earnest that we're doing what we say we want to do? Because we want to be held accountable. We want people to see that we're doing what we say we are going to do. And so, going back to the, diversity thing and the whole George Floyd incident, people making these statements saying what they're all about. Well, yeah, going back and looking at what have you done? You've had 12 months now. Have you put, the emphasis behind these things that you said you were? I think that's awesome. And I think it's warranted. And I applaud you for that.
Thank you. And I think that put your money where your mouth is an important concept in this space. It's really easy because I don't think anybody, I shouldn't say anybody because we've seen it in this country, but I don't think for the most part, people condone racism, prejudice, all kinds of other types of behaviors. But really taking a step to make a change as opposed to just taking a statement and saying that's bad, don't do that anymore, I think is important. And there's some organizations obviously are doing better than others, have stepped up. Some of it's a resource issue, some of it's just motivation.
Sure. You talk about, I think I said in the introduction that, one of your key tenets is, you're really about sports, using the good in sports to produce social change, right? Positive social change is really the key there. What affected, where did you come up with that? Was that something that in your upbringing or maybe in your professional life, I know you mentioned about seeing the players that were being underserved in that environment. Is there anything else behind that when you look back at your history that really drove that?
Yeah, I think there's really the whole start to my life. If I look at the, we'll call it before I was even born, in the first 4 or 5 years of my life that led that direction. My parents are both originally from South Africa. They left in 1963 when they got married because they were anti-apartheid. They did not want to raise kids in an apartheid society. They didn't believe in it, even though their families were all there. They left and they moved to Israel, which is where I was born. So again, having the connections to South Africa and Israel kind of set the stage for prejudice racism. Going to Israel, you've got the background of anti-Semitism, of the Middle East conflict. And then I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I have a younger sister who's developmentally disabled. And so I was 4 years old when she was born. So obviously for most of my life, that's been a significant element in my life. So I think when you piece together all of the elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, those three events, situations really highlighted and formed the basis for a lot of what I'm doing. I think I probably would have gotten there anyway, but I think that it's pretty clear that those have been embedded in me from a very, very young age.
Those are definitely very formative items, and I appreciate you sharing that because going back in the background is you have some deep experience there. Looking at some of the programming you were talking about. So one of the things you talked to me about last week was this World Sports Philanthropy World 2021 that's coming up. Do you want to give the listeners and viewers a little bit of background information, what that is and purpose of it?
Sure. Our Sports Philanthropy World Conference is our signature event each year. When we launched in 2019, it was, I think, and still ultimately is designed to be an in-person event. Mm-hmm. I think that the goal of the event is to bring people together to interact, network, and find opportunities for collaboration, hear the voices, learn some of the best practices that are out there. So we were brand new. We weren't even 6 months old. We had 120 organizations involved. But what really opened my eyes was the amount of interest of people who weren't even able to get to Chicago for the event. Mm-hmm. So we had inquiries from 87 countries.
Wow.
About the event. And the responses range from the generic, I wish I could be there, to will you bring one of these to my country because we need one of these in my country or on my continent, to I would be there, but your country won't give me a visa in time to make it. So it was interesting and eye-opening to see such a great demand and interest in the topic. When I launched it, I didn't know what the response was going to be. So that was really gratifying. The first year we had a fantastic, day and a half. We had a reception the night before and a full day of panels, but it was a much smaller undertaking, in part because in a virtualized space last year in 2020, we could do a lot more. Sure. People didn't need to travel. It was easier to create multiple tracks of programming because you don't need 7 big breakout rooms for the conversation, right? You can have sessions and interactive things. So we had last year we had a main stage that hosted 7 high-level panels plus 5 keynote presentations. Then we had 7 program tracks that each had 8 sessions. So the program tracks mirrored our core pillars, which are health and safety, number 1, sports access, number 2, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, number 3. And then the other 4 program tracks were an international track, a fundraising track, a nonprofit skill development track, and then a still as unnamed wildcard track, which kind of took everything else that didn't fit neatly into one of the other boxes. And then on top of that, we had workshops on a number of different issues, from social media to culture, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of the day, it was 2 full days of programming. We were fortunate to be joined by some high-level people from the sports world, former NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, Lee Steinberg, who's one of the top sports agents, worked on that builds homes for single moms, Troy Vincent, who's the executive VP of the NFL, and a number of amazing people who do great work that may not be a star athlete that people would have heard of, but are doing incredible things with their companies, with their nonprofits around the world.
No, that's awesome. A global impact, 87 countries. That's pretty impressive. You must be pretty proud of that.
It is nice. It's nice to see the growth of what we're doing. It's one of the great things in this role is I get the opportunity to spend all day, every day talking to people that are really making an impact,
Sure.
talking to them about how they're making an impact, learning from them. I learn an incredible amount. As you asked about the business plan, I was laughing because I was thinking I've learned so much more by hosting the podcast, by talking to people, by having these conversations than I could ever learn by researching a business plan.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this summit or event, who's that open to? Is that open to the just anybody and everybody?
It is open to anybody and everybody. I would say that the target is really people in a few markets. So it's anybody who works in the sports nonprofit space, anybody who really works anywhere in the sports business world, because in today's international culture and global affairs, everything touches something else. So you can't have a professional sports franchise without understanding how your franchise interacts and relates to the community. You
Sure.
have to recognize we're not alone here. And so you take an example, we recently had Jesse Marks from the Miami Dolphins on our podcast, and he was part of Lee Steinberg Sports Philanthropy Summit with me last week. They're doing incredible work, and I'll use them as one of the examples. So they've put a huge initiative into feeding the community. But instead of taking what I would call the easy route and just providing food for the people that they want to provide food to, they went a few additional steps and recruited local restaurants in those communities to provide the food for the people in those communities. So now they're supporting the owners of that business in the community. They're supporting all the staff who now can be employed in that restaurant, in that community. So you're really magnifying and amplifying the impact of the food program by using other resources in the community for good.
You're really speaking my language there, because I'm a big advocate of support small businesses, buy local, and really, like you said, magnify that impact of what you're doing. Can you give us a little peek behind the scenes? So an event like that, because you said you're a pretty small staff, what does it take? Like, what are the key enablers for you to put on an event like that?
Well, we were fortunate to have some great interns working with us. I think you need a virtual event platform. We used a system called FeedLoop. It tied in with Zoom, so it allowed us to do a lot of the functionality through Zoom, which means it was easier for people because they were comfortable. But we could host the registration, we could create speaker bios and all of the things on that platform. And so there's a great amount of detail that goes into running any event. I think for those who haven't been involved in running events of any nature, whether it's a conference, a golf tournament, a wedding, you think of all of the moving parts that go into it. And so certainly not something I could have done alone. We had some great staff people helping. We had some great interns helping. And in a virtual event, the technology is really the key, and leveraging that technology. But ultimately, people come to an event in part because of the substance and what the conversation is, but in much bigger part, in my view, because of the people that are going to be there and who they're going to get to interact with. And the ability of the attendees to interact with each other is really the key. And so there's a lot of people who came to the event that are in some aspects of the business or sports business world that care about social good, social change, care about community impact. And so they want to connect with others who have those same passions.
Sure. Absolutely. Question for you here. What is the biggest lesson that you learned through starting the Sports Philanthropy Network and the experiences you've had so far?
It's interesting. I mean, that's a long list of everything I've learned. It's hard to boil it down to one. I think the key is you have to start with good people. It's really challenging to grow any organization.
Mhm.
And in the cliche of, one step forward and two steps back, right? When you're small, that gets amplified. If you're 100-person organization and you have a bad hire, okay, you've got 99 other people that are still doing the work and still rowing the same direction. When you're 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, when you bring in somebody, that becomes a challenge in terms of the growth. And then that has to do with interns, that has to do with staff, right? That has to do with consultants that are working with you. And I think what you learn fairly early on is we've got to really be careful about conserving resources because we're young and we're growing. And so, using just a silly example that came up today of like a technology company with something we do that says, okay, we'll give you a discount if you pay for it by the year instead of on a month-to-month software license.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'd like to save that money, but I'd rather have the money to be able to pay my staff and not be running right to the edge of those types of things. So as you go further down, sure, there's ways to create economy of scale as we grow. And I think that's one of the challenges. I think the second thing for me has been the ability to rely on other people and get comfortable delegating more of the work and higher level work in order to not get me bogged down, right? Because if everything's got to go through Roy, then Roy's a bottleneck, and things don't get done. And you want everything to be perfect, but at the same time, if it's coming out a month later than it should come out, then that's not perfect either. Right. So you have to somewhat go with the theory of get it done as well, try and be perfect, try and get it there. But most things that go up on the web can be changed. And so sometimes the ability to let go, trying to put myself more in that role of working on the business instead of in the business is really where I've been trying to focus over the last 6 months.
Those are great lessons. The one about the people, especially, it's the smaller the organization, the more critical it is that you hire well, right? And because people are the organization, whether it's a nonprofit or an actual, business services company or manufacturing company, the people are the business. So hiring good people and really having a solid hiring process is critical, right?
And I think as you say that, right, the challenge is that in the smaller scale, right, each person is a much higher percentage of the impact of the organization. Right. And that's also the person that's representing you to the outside world. Yeah. And it's something that we work with all of our interns or anybody else coming onto the team in terms of social media, because if you've got in your profile that you're an intern for the Sports Philanthropy Network and you're tweeting out something hateful or offensive, that doesn't work well, right? If you're some type of business, maybe it doesn't matter. But when our core model is diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, I think that becomes a big problem. Yeah. And so we spend time with everybody that comes into the organization really talking about the tone of that, right? I can't control what Jared's going to do, right? But if Jared ends up being a board member of Sports Philanthropy Network, we've got to have a comfort level that the tone of conversation and communication is not racist, sexist, discriminatory, prejudice, any of those types of things are just not going to be aligned with our core values.
Well, it goes back to embracing the culture, right? You're bringing people on. You want people who work for you who embrace the same values and the same culture as you're promoting. That's key, right?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this, because we've got people on, all over who are listening to this who could possibly in some way help you. Do you have anything that you want to ask the world at large, ways to help Sports Philanthropy Network in the next few months or even year to grow and to achieve their mission?
Well, I think the first thing is if anybody can find us some winning Powerball numbers, that would really go a long way to supporting our growth. But our website is at sportsphilanthropynetwork.org. There's a lot of ways to get involved. We have task forces that we're launching on 28 special interest areas over the next 7 months. I encourage you to come and join the network and apply to be part of one of those. We launched message boards to engage people in conversation and give people a safe place where they can talk about the issues that are relevant to the nonprofit space that are different from a LinkedIn group or a Facebook group where you can't be sure who's getting on there and you may be concerned about privacy issues or disclosing information about your board or your organization or things like that. From a big picture perspective, there's literally no end to the ways that we could get you involved. So I encourage you to reach out and tell us what you're interested in, because if you're in Phoenix and you're interested in soccer, I may connect you to one group. If you're in Dallas and you're interested in football, it's going to be a different group. And if you're in New York and you're interested in skating, we've got a different group. So we need to understand what you are interested in. When people join the network, we've got a fairly extensive member intake form that we send out that allows them to really identify what are the core elements that they're interested in, what are their favorite teams, what are their favorite sports, because we want to connect you to the types of things that are meaningful to you. As a lot of people ask us, where can they fit in, where can they help? And I say it's really limited only by our creativity. If Jared and I sit down and have a conversation, I can find a way using Jared's skill set, using Jared's relationships to show him where that can benefit some of our organizations.
Absolutely true. And I'm going to urge all of our viewers and listeners to reach out to Roy and the Sports Philanthropy Network, see where you can plug in, see where you can help out. Like he said, the options are endless. So, Roy, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your experience here. It's always a pleasure whenever we get together. I always love to learn more about your experience and also what you're doing with the Sports Philanthropy Network. I'm really anxious to see what the future holds too here. Before we sign off, any parting words for someone who wants to start a small business, entrepreneurial venture, or a nonprofit?
Yeah, I think that the key thing is, if you're going to start, from the business side, I think it's really thinking through the fundamentals of what you are good at and what you're going to need help with. Nobody's good at everything. And even if you are that theoretical person that's good at everything, you don't have the time or the bandwidth to handle everything. And so creating that roadmap for yourself of understanding, like, what support do I need? And this applies whether it's a profit or a nonprofit business, because at that level, a startup, it's no different, right? Your mission may be to make money or not, but most startup businesses never make money.
Mm-hmm.
So the underlying principles of business relate equally well to nonprofits as to for-profits.
Great advice. Thank you, Roy. Thank you again. To our listeners, be well, be safe, and be productive. Thanks for listening to our podcast today, and we really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to reach out to Roy for more information, you can find Roy on LinkedIn at Roy Kessel, or you can email him at rkessel@sportsloop.com. Additional links that we discussed on the podcast are below, such as the sportsphilanthropynetwork.org, roykessel.com, links to the 2021 Sports Philanthropy World event in June, as well as the Sports Philanthropy Network podcast. If you want to recommend somebody to appear on the podcast as a guest, please email us at info@opsqc.com. If you're interested in sponsoring a podcast, please reach out to us at the same email. We'd love to have your support.